How can you bring the maximum impact to your community by being aware of Justice 40 and understanding how you can use knowledge of this program, this government-wide initiative, this whole of government initiative, as they call it, in your community? So we've turned to a partner in our community, Simon Nee, and I'll have Simon introduce himself a bit more and then tell you how he's been able to use Justice 40 and bring you some tips. Simon?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Sandy. And thanks to both you and Rosanna for organizing this. Hi, everyone. I'm Simon Nee. I'm the Grants Commissioner for the City of Toledo. I lead most of our discretionary grant seeking efforts at the city, as well as supporting coordination and partnerships on grant applications with other agencies and organizations, both in Toledo and in the broader region. So we, as I think Sandy and Rosanna made pretty clear, we're in a uniquely favorable funding environment for a community like Toledo right now, where there's an emphasis on investing in communities that have historically not been invested in, or where there's been disinvestment, but where we also have a strong story to tell about revitalization, redevelopment, and opportunity. We've been successful here at the city at accessing funds from several Justice 40 covered programs, as well as some of the benefits that come with applying with a project that addresses the Justice 40 criteria. We've got a $20 million raise grant from USDOT last year. More recently, we were awarded through the Reconnecting Communities and Neighborhoods program, as well as the U.S. Forest Service Inflation Reduction Act Urban and Community Forestry program. So you might say it's easy for the city of Toledo to hit these disadvantaged community criteria. You're the city of Toledo. What about the rest of the region? I think Sandy and Rosanna already showed that there are communities throughout the region, not just in the city, that hit these disadvantaged community criteria. And I do think there are ways that we can also think creatively as a region about how to work together to access some of those benefits. So those are some of the kind of tips, I guess, that I want to share with you today. Sandy and Rosanna already talked about some of the benefits that can come with presenting a project that you can make the case primarily serves a disadvantaged community, however that's defined in your NOFO, and I'll get into that in just a minute. But as they talked about, some of these programs specifically provide for priority consideration for projects in disadvantaged communities. There's set aside pots of funding for disadvantaged communities, and of course the one that we all like the most is match waivers, which we at the city have been fortunate enough to be able to secure 100% funding on some pretty big infrastructure projects using these disadvantaged community provisions. So if we'll just go to the next slide. So what is a Justice 40 community, right? What is a disadvantaged community? Well, the fact is that there's not really one thing. There's not really one definition of a Justice 40 community or a disadvantaged community, right? Justice 40 is not it's not a yes or no criterion that you can apply to an individual census tract. It's a mandate, and every federal agency has developed different ways of defining what constitutes a disadvantaged community. There's a kind of a proliferation of these tools, these online maps that agencies ask you to use to identify your disadvantaged communities. There's starting to be more coherence around a couple that are already shown in TMACOG's database, those being the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, the USDOT Equitable Transportation Community Explorer, but that's by no means universal. There's still agencies out there using EJ Screen. There's still agencies out there using good old-fashioned poverty rates. So the important thing here is to know how your NOFO defines a disadvantaged community, right? Sometimes it offers more than one option and allows you to make the case. And there are times, there are examples, which I'll talk about in just a minute, of times when the NOFO gives you some latitude to argue that your project, even if it's not located in what they would consider a disadvantaged community, that it may primarily serve disadvantaged communities, right? And the other I guess strategy that we've pursued with some of you that are represented on the call today is just leveraging partnerships around regional projects, which I'll get into that in just a little bit. So if we go to the next slide. So these are two actual definitions of a disadvantaged community from two actual NOFOs, right? And I just want to highlight how different they are. The first one, projects in a disadvantaged or underserved community do not require non-federal cost share. Applicants should use CJST, the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool. So that one's pretty cut and dry. Your project's got to be in a CEJST disadvantaged community. Not a lot of room for interpretation there, right? The second one I think is more interesting and the one I want to talk about a little bit more. Applicants must provide federal highway with sufficient information that the proposed project would serve disadvantaged communities based on the majority of census tracts served by the project. And it goes on to say that the applicant should explain how the proposed project may serve census tracts outside of the one where it's located. So as an applicant, when you see something like this, that's, to me, that says, when they say you tell us, I take that as an opportunity as a grant writer, right? Like this kind of vagueness in a NOFO language, if you've got a project that you feel like you can make the case for, but doesn't necessarily show up on one of their maps, and this does happen, take that opening, be a little bit creative, and I'll talk a little bit about how to just some ideas and strategies for thinking creatively about that. So if we go to the next slide. So just in the interest of simplicity, this is not a real example. This is just sort of a very simplified hypothetical example, but I think it illustrates the kind of the kind of basic creativity that you can approach some of these NOFOs with when you do have an opening, like the one we saw in the second definition. Let's say you're the University of Toledo. The part of the University Parks Trail on your campus isn't done yet. You want to apply for a federal active transportation grant to finish it. You look at your CEJST map, which is what you see here. You see that your project's not on the map, but there's a bunch of census tracts right around you that are. Well, if you look at how entities like the Trust for Public Land define walkability, right? It's typically like a walkable park to them is a 10-minute walk or a half-mile away, right? So if this project is going to serve pedestrians, for whom is it walkable to? Draw a half-mile buffer around your project. Lo and behold, you pick up 3 or 4 disadvantaged census tracts, right? And again, that's highly oversimplified, but we've worked on applications in the past where we have had to think a little bit beyond the I guess the strict literal definition of is it in the disadvantaged community or not, and think bigger picture about who is this actually serving, right? So if we could go to the next slide. To the point about leveraging partnerships, this is an actual example from an application that we worked with Lucas County as well as several other jurisdictions in TMCOG's area on for a Safe Streets for All regional application to the US DOT. This was one where they wanted to see percentages of communities served by a project that are disadvantaged, right? And this table, disadvantage being, I think they used ETCE on that one. So This table actually went into the application. Pretty simple. Shows our 5 project areas, shows the percentage of disadvantaged census tracts served by the project, either where it was located or directly adjacent to in this case. If you're BG, your project doesn't clear the threshold that they were sort of implicitly looking for in this case, which was the 40% threshold, but you add it all up and you pull in some communities with much higher disadvantage percentages, you get well over that 40%. So thinking about combining projects together, presenting a coherent sort of regional vision for why all of these projects are um, part of a shared vision or shared set of priorities. You can access those benefits in a way that you may not be able to if you were going out on your own. So if you go to the next slide. So just going beyond that threshold, yes, no eligibility question. And I think this is where tools like the one that we saw from Teamacog are going to come in really handy. Beyond just qualifying for those benefits, these tools also provide a lot of really useful data that can help you tell a really compelling story about your project and tailor your argument to the priorities of the NOFO. I think one thing that we found in developing these applications is that these tools often give you a really good foundation to stack other data sources on, I suppose, to tell that story, right? So, a tool like ETCE gives you some basics about your whether your community is disadvantaged, in what ways it's disadvantaged, right? But then there's many other tools out there, both from the agencies and from other sources that you can use to go deeper into the demographics of your community and to tell to paint a picture for the reader, right? To tell a story about how things have gotten to be the way they are, what it's like to be a resident of that community right now, and how the project will address some of those inequities that you're identifying. So this is just a quick list of tools that I have found useful in my own work developing these applications. I'll talk a little bit about a couple of these. I think you're all probably familiar with, we all know the census data. Anyone in transportation probably knows ODOT's crash database. One that I just wanted to mention real quick was for active transportation projects. The the app Strava has a sort of beefed up version of the platform um, for municipalities, parks, districts, anyone working in active transportation. You have to apply for it and request it, but it's free, and it gives you a lot of really interesting back end data about the way that parks and trails and things like that are used in your area that can be that is difficult to access anywhere else and can be really helpful for storytelling purposes, right? So if we go to the next slide, um, this is just one example of how we kind of stacked some of these different sources in our Reconnecting Communities and Neighborhoods application. We knew that we had these census tracts that were qualified as disadvantaged in CJST, but we also knew that there would be lots and lots of communities coming in for the pot of money that had the match waiver attached to it for disadvantaged communities. So we needed to go beyond just saying these are disadvantaged communities. We needed to really tell a story about these communities, right? So some of the tools we use to do that, STEEP, the screening tool for equity analysis of projects. That's a USDOT tool that a lot of these NOFOs are encouraging you to use as a tool in your equity analysis to understand populations that are going to benefit from the project. That screenshot is that's our project area with a half-mile buffer and a 1 mile buffer. You set those buffers, it will give you all kinds of data about that area. That just makes it easier to collect data about the people that you are arguing are going to benefit from your project, so you don't have to go in and collect things census tract by census tract, right? And I think the important thing about it is that it's an agency recognized tool, it's an agency developed tool. So if it can make your life easier and you can point to it and say, hey, you made this, you told us to use this, here's what it says, right? I'm a big advocate for um, when you've got more than one tool, sometimes one helps you tell your story better than the other. And if they're all tools that are sort of acknowledged as legitimate or even developed by the agencies, as long as you clearly address that threshold qualification that's in your NOFO, you can kind of pick and choose and sort of cherry pick and put together data from these different sources to tell the most compelling story you can. So looking at things like lack of car ownership, looking at things like environmental burden, transportation safety and crash data, right? We were able to point to the fact that, Front Street is a really dangerous corridor. And with partnership from Metro Parks, they were able to get us some data about where visitors to Glass City Metro Park are coming from. So we said, hey, we've got a lot of folks from East Toledo trying to cross this really dangerous street. We need to do something about this, right? And again, this is I think having this tool that TeamAcog shared is going to make this whole process just a lot faster and easier. It'll allow us to have all that data in one place rather than having to go through and kind of cherry pick, right? So if we go to the next slide, I just wanted to really quickly highlight the ETCE if you're not familiar with it, because it's just one sort of relatively quick and easy tool that you can, and I think it's a good example of how you can go a little bit deeper than yes, no, disadvantaged or not, and take some of this data to and draw on it sort of strategically to tell a story, right? If you look at that census tract there, where our Reconnecting Communities project was, it was interesting to me that if you look at these 5 disadvantage component scores, it didn't clear the disadvantage threshold on transportation insecurity. But then this tool allows you to take that component score and break it out further. If you look at that 3-bar chart below, and you can see that it does consider this neighborhood to be heavily cost burdened and have heavy safety burdens. So then you can use that to you can draw on that in your narrative, right? Sure, maybe it doesn't clear that threshold, but if you look at cost and safety, we know there's an issue here, right? So we can go to the next slide. So these are just, I hope this is a useful, just kind of like set of tips and tricks and tools to kind of pull from. I think the big things to keep in mind as you're thinking about how to benefit from these Justice 40 provisions are to know what your NOFO defines as a disadvantaged community at a really basic level. But when you can, don't be afraid to think a little bit creatively within the limits of that definition, right? And then I think that the big thing to keep in mind, not just for these, but for any grant application, is that all of this data can be a really powerful storytelling tool, right? I think it's helpful to remember that they draw reviewers from all over the country in many cases. A lot of the people who read your application may not know anything about Toledo. So you, as the local entity, are in the best position to tell that story to that reader, tell the story of your community in a compelling way. And I think all of these data tools are really they're really helpful resources for that. A strong grant application is a strong story, well supported by data that addresses the priorities, both sort of clearly spelled out and implicit to an extent of an OFO, right? And I mean that's an oversimplification, right? There's much more to a grant application than that. But thinking about your narrative, many times it's a good story, well supported by data.